Here today for the interview is my friend and fellow Solution Tree colleague, Luis Cruz. Luis has been a public school educator for over 30 years and has served students and families in elementary school, middle school, and high school, both as a teacher and a school administrator. And today, Luis is a consultant and an author who addresses issues related to equity, to English language learners, transformational leadership, and redesigning school systems for the potential to move more effectively to address our new definition of what we mean when we say all. So, Luis, I want to welcome you to the podcast today.
Buenos dias. Happy to be with you, Tom. Thank you for the invitation. I'm honored, honestly. Thank you.
It is so great to have you here. Not only do I value our connection as friends, but I just have the utmost respect for you and your work, and all of the incredible inspiration that you bring to teachers and educators, literally around the world. And I know you're going to bring that today in the podcast as well. No pressure, right? So let's that's right. Let's jump right into it. And before we dig into the substance and the content of our conversation today, let's start with you and the arc of your career. Walk us through the journey and maybe, those impact points along the journey that led you to becoming this author, this speaker, this globally recognized leader and expert in so many areas: equity, multilingual learners, RTI, so many areas. Tell us about the journey, Luis. What's the arc of your story?
Yeah, thank you. It's funny when you say that, I instantly reflect back on a couple of things that happened in my life that I think led me to be able to do this amazing work and love doing it, right? I think the first is that growing up, my parents are immigrants from Ecuador. They came here to the United States. My grandfather was the first to come here. And then the rest of my family came. I was actually born here in Los Angeles, California, first generation from the Cruz family. But growing up, the one thing that I think had a significant impact in my life was the fact that my parents, unlike most parents during the time that were telling their kids to forget about Spanish and embrace English because they were concerned that their kids would not learn English enough, so it's better to let go of one language and learn this new language. My parents were very different. They wanted me to embrace the keeping of Spanish while learning English. And I had a grandfather who lived down the street from me. We called him Tito because I couldn't say abuelito, so grandfather in Spanish. So I said Tito. And Tito every afternoon would have me go to his home. I remember being maybe 5, 6 and running down there, and he would teach me Spanish from an actual book that he had ordered from Ecuador. And so he would teach me Spanish so that over time, my Spanish wouldn't be sort of disappearing, if you will. It wouldn't disappear. It would remain as part of who I was. And so that was a significant part of my life because my first teacher, honestly, was my grandfather, who would take the time, 45 minutes, to literally have me read and write in Spanish because he did not want me to forget Spanish. Flash forward, I'm 18 years old, graduated from high school. I'm working at a supermarket called Lucky's, and I'm actually a courtesy clerk, have 2 goals in life. I always share this story: to lower my car and to purchase a pull-out stereo. That's all I wanted. Woman walks into the store, asks me to help put her groceries in the trunk of her car. And she says to me, "Mijo, ¿me puedes ayudar con mis bolsas, por favor? Can you please help me with my groceries?" And I responded in Spanish. She hears me speak Spanish and she smiles and says, "You speak Spanish very well. Would you be interested in working for our local school district as a bilingual teacher's aide?" And I looked at her and said, "Thank you, but I'm a courtesy clerk. I'm making a fat $4.25 an hour. I'm good." And then she says to me the words that I often say changed my life. She says, "We pay $10 an hour." And so I thought to myself, who in their right minds would pay someone $10 an hour to work with kids? How hard could that be? Well, little did I know that within 2 weeks of the job, I fell in love with something called first graders. And they were amazing. And I found myself no longer wanting to lower my car. I just wanted them to do well. So that was a significant episode in my life. And the third was in college. A professor, Dr. Isaac Cardenas, the department chair for the Chicano Studies program, asked me if I would speak to incoming high school students about my journey and how I got to the university. And I thought to myself, speaking in public, my God, that's frightening. how many high school kids were going to be there? And he said, something like 20. I said, 20? That's a lot of kids. He says, just share your story, Luis. Well, long story short, 300 of them showed up. And I was on this stage trembling about speaking to them in public. But as I began to share my story, they started laughing. They started really sort of embracing my journey. And so that was my first introduction to public speaking, something that I do now for a living. When I asked the professor why he chose me, he said, because I knew you could do this. You're the only one that didn't know you could do this. And so I think that was how I was introduced to the work I do today. So a combination of those 3 episodes in my life, I think are what led me to where I am today.
It's interesting, those formative years, right?
Yeah,
The impact that just those moments can have on us. They stick with us, and they are always in the backdrop of everything we do. I'm sure it's still to this day, as you've just told those stories, those memories are fresh in your mind, and it
they are.
probably think of them every time you get in front of an audience and you are presenting in front of hundreds, if not thousands, of people. Thinking about that first time you were asked to do the presentation in front of 300 students, where you thought it was going to be 20.
Yes.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so, you talk about this new sort of focus of what we mean when we say all. For years, so many of us have asserted this notion that all means all, and it's almost at risk of becoming a cliche when we say all means
Right.
all. But we authentically mean that our mission is to serve all learners. And that, of course, is still applicable today. That hasn't changed. But as I mentioned in the intro, and I just mentioned a moment ago, you talk a lot about society's new definition of all. So,
Hmm.
for those maybe not familiar with what you mean by that, what is that new definition of all, and maybe contrast that with the previous definition?
Yeah, so I think that sometimes because we're so wrapped up in the ins and outs of daily life at a school, in a classroom, we forget context, right? And so what I have found is that we have to remind our hardworking educators that schools do not exist in a vacuum. In other words, we are a result of things that happen outside of schools, correct? And so when things outside of schools happen, politics, technological advances, economy, it affects directly what happens in schools. And so I often ask audiences, I play a game of Jeopardy with them, and I ask them to identify, Jeopardy style, who the father of the American public school system is. And you'll be surprised that many cannot, right?
Mhm.
But once in a while, some people will say Horace Mann. They'll nail it, right? Because Horace Mann, historically, is considered the father of the American public school system. And so this is the question I pose. Did Horace Mann create a system that is in line with what we have today in our schools? And then I say it's a new definition of all, because he didn't write a chapter called "For the English Learners, Here's What We'll Do." For the children with IEPs, this is what we'll do. For the children who come from poverty, this is what we'll do. For students of color, this is what we'll do. So the bottom line is that the definition of all back in 1830 was not the definition of all we have today, right? If you are not a white male who owned land, you are not part of the all.
Right.
So understanding that the system that we have was never created for the intentionality of the all we have today, which are all those different kinds of people that I mentioned, I think helps people understand that whether we believe it or not, we're in the business of redesigning a system that was never intended for the definition of all today in 2021, right? And so historically, I think we need to look at that. And should we be grateful to have an American public school system? Absolutely. Should we be grateful that Horace Mann and others formed what is now our American public school system? Absolutely. But much of the way it happens with our phones, we need a serious update, right?
Yeah.
Because the iPhone 2000, iPhone 4 or 5 wouldn't work today as well as we would want it to work. Well, the same thing is true about our educational system, and the fact that, bottom line, we have a new definition of all.
That's such an interesting tension we have with the past, right? There are so many, the irony of, we have a public school system created to be the great equalizer, to provide equal opportunity. as long as you're a white male.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of dichotomy or the irony of the situation. And now we get into, our more modern definition, and all seems to keep expanding in terms of our understanding as we modernize conversations around gender, as we modernize
Right.
conversations around, the acute impact of immigrants and
Right.
situations at the border. We just the expanded notion of all, and how do you see, like, how do we navigate that? How do we begin to keep continue to have an understanding of what that means, when it just seems like the all means all keeps expanding and keeps challenging us? What are some of the core fundamentals maybe that we just have to realize or keep in mind as we think about
Mm.
that expansive definition of all?
It's funny because I have found myself lately reminding educators that I have the honor of working with two things. One, that we are professional educators, right? You would think, well, that's a given, but let's be clear, we are not amateur educators. We are professional educators, meaning that we have a skill set that regular people don't have when it comes to learning, right? And producing learning in others, right?
Yeah.
And the second thing that I have to remind people of is that we're public school educators, meaning our job is to take in whoever's part of that public, right? I often joke that private school teachers, as hard as I'm sure they work, cannot compare themselves to public school teachers. Now, mind you, I attended private Catholic school growing up. And I often tell the story of how ninth grade school year, a kid in my class lights up a joint, and we're all looking at him like this guy's being a rebel. And all I remember is a nun walking in and saying, "You come with me." And then I say, I haven't seen that guy in 32 years after that incident, right?
Yeah.
Because see, in a private school setting, we get to sort of weed out whoever's not going to make it.
Yeah.
But as public school educators, we take them all.
Yeah.
And in my days as the high school principal, I would have in the same room the kid that was dying to get into Harvard, but came from poverty, the kid who just immigrated here from El Salvador. And then I had the grandchild of the grandfather who started the local gang in the community. And I had to figure out, along with our faculty and staff, how we were going to give them each the opportunity to flourish in life. And that's what makes us unique. So I think we need to remind ourselves that when we signed up to become public school professional educators, we were going to make sure that all kids who showed up at our doorstep, documented, undocumented, English, no English, we're going to get the best from our professional skill set designed to produce learning for this new definition of all.
I love that reference to professional, because so often in my work, when we talk about assessment, we talk about using our professional judgment. And that is true, that we have a skill set and an expertise. And folks often talk about, oh, Tom, that's so subjective. Well, subjectivity is taking your research papers to a construction site and asking the carpenters to sort through them. That's subjective. What we use is professional judgment. And I think your emphasis on that professional is such an important reminder for all of us. And I can't go on without mentioning your reference to weeding out the. I don't know if that pun was intended or unintended, but I couldn't let it go. It was like, wow, that was a great point. We weed them out in more ways than one, for sure. So let's
haven't
talk about
seen that guy since freshman year.
Since freshman year, right? So let's talk about leadership, because we know leadership matters, right? And we can all say that leadership matters. But when it comes to this expansive definition of all meaning all, and we think about that paradigm, what are some specific things that leaders, school or district leaders, can do to really sort of energize or re-energize their colleagues around this renewed mission of that expansive definition of all? What are some of the things that leaders can specifically do?
Yeah, and here's where I think we now need to be a little bit more specific about the kind of leadership we need. Because if schools do not exist in a vacuum, then we know that based on the norms that we see in society making their way into schools, it's going to require a specific kind of leadership. There was a time when schools just required managers. In fact, there's a classic book that we study in administrative credential programs called, Managers of Virtue, because the world was one in such where in businesses, managers were needed. So the thought was schools also need managers, right?
Right.
Well, it's clear today that if we're really going to redesign the system for the new definition of all, we need a specific kind of leadership, not just leadership in its generic form. And so the kind of leadership that both Dr. Anthony Muhammad and I are very passionate about and we write about is transformational leadership, right?
Mhm.
An understanding that what we're basically saying is change is going to be required. And we get it. Change is very uncomfortable for the adults that comprise schools. Not so much the children, but definitely the adults. And so this kind of leadership that we have found called transformational leadership is going to allow us to not only embrace change, but to make sure that the enthusiasm for change spreads from leaders to those that are first followers. And we're going to increase things like motivation, morale, but most important, performance, right? So here's what we're finding. It's silly to think that because we have a new set of knowledge that educators are simply going to run with it. The truth of the matter is that change is very difficult in our profession because we've been conditioned to believe that the way we experienced it 30 years back might be the way that these kids need to experience it, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
So when we leave transformational leadership out of the equation, we leave out the vehicle that drives the changes that are necessary for us to redesign this system. So it's a conversation that is very important and one that can no longer be synonymous with admin. So when I go to a school and I say, talk to me about leadership, educators are quick to point out who the administrators are.
Right.
But what I often say is we can no longer associate leadership with only admin. Why don't we have in that same description or identification teacher leaders, classified leaders? Because what I found in my experience is that if teachers are not part of that leadership, if classified staff is not part of the leadership, along with admin, then what you end up creating is a fad, not a movement, right?
Right.
And so as long as those principles are there, we'll continue doing this work. But the moment they leave, we're back down to square zero. So it's an essential part of the change that we're seeking.
When you talk about transformational leadership, are there some key elements that are important for administrators or leaders? We expand this definition of leader. We try to be inclusive with leadership. And of course, there are certain things about a title that go along with responsibilities and decision making, et cetera. But trying to expand that view, what are some of the specifics around that transformation? What are some mindsets, specific practices, or systems or structures that can be put in place to sustain some of those expansive views of what leadership means?
Yeah, I think there's a couple. I mean, one I mentioned, right? It can no
Yeah,
longer be synonymous with only admin.
right.
The second is that it's not a I, it's a we. In other words, what team is going to make the change happen that we need? Three, it deals directly with change. So transformational leadership is not about managing, it's not about maintaining, it's actually designed to help change particular aspects of a system, which we know are policies, practices, procedures, but most importantly, people's mindsets, right?
Right.
So here's where Carol Dweck's work comes into play, because transformational leadership is designed to change mindsets so that the other aspects of a system, policies, practices, procedures, change. Those things don't change unless we have the right mindset at a school. So
Right.
this whole notion of moving from a fixed to a growth mindset is what transformational leadership helps us develop in our faculty and staff. I often say there are no evil people in our schools. No one wakes up in the morning and writes down on their things to do list, today I will screw over as many kids as I can.
Right.
That would be evil. But we do have people that are very fixed minded about the possibility that a system can help our new definition of all learn at high levels.
Right.
So transformational leadership is absolutely designed to be able to accomplish that. And it's something that we need to now begin to embrace in schools and districts throughout our country.
And we know that leadership is not just a clinical exercise. We also know there's an
Right.
emotional side to
Oh,
change. So,
absolutely.
tips for managing that from a school leader's perspective. Even though we have this expansive definition of leadership, when you think about principals or you think about superintendents or district leaders, what are some things they can think about also when it comes to that emotional side of change, where teachers might be reluctant to let go of past practice and it's
That's
more of an
right.
emotional connection than it is a clinical one? Thoughts?
Yeah, in our work in 2019, I had the honor of co-authoring a book with Dr. Anthony Mohammed, who, as you know, is a giant in our profession.
Hmm.
And it was such an honor because we really were able to dive into his original work found in Transforming School Culture. And what we found is that there are rational reasons why people would resist change, whether that be a change in instructional practice, use of assessments, grading practices, which obviously you've done an amazing job of writing about and teaching us all about. But here's the deal. When people don't, here's what we found. People will rationally resist when they don't understand why something needs a change.
Hmm.
In other words, if we as leaders, and I'm not just talking about admin,
Right.
are not using data to persuade, if we're not giving people a sense of urgency as to why something must change, they're not going to want to change.
Right.
So the first emotional response to resistance to change is, I don't understand why something has to change. You're asking me to change, but I don't understand why. That's going to be the first. The second is when people don't trust those advocating for the change. In other words, you just got here as the new principal. We've had 4 principals in the last 7 years.
Right.
Why should we trust you? So it's got to be a combination of 3 things that creates trust based on our research, right? It's got to be empathy, which is not synonymous with sympathy,
Right.
but it's got to be empathy, credibility, and reliability all coming together to create a trustworthy relationship between a team of people, not just admin, advocating for these changes. And then third, it's got to be, we're going to show you how. We might take small steps to get there. We're not just going to tell you in one quick, student free day how to do this and then let you go and expect you to be able to do it. We're going to invite you to problem solve with us. We're going to invite you to figure this out with us. Because if we don't invite you, then we're building the fence all by ourselves. I often say people are less likely to tear down a fence they help build. So we're going to learn the how by reaching out to you, and together we're going to figure out how best to do this.
Right.
We found that when faculty and staff members who come into our profession, let's be reminded, with the moral imperative to want to help kids, but when they're fed the why, who, and how of this work, of this change that we're advocating, they become promoters of the change versus resistors of the change. Now, there is irrational people in our schools. Let's not pretend. There are people that will always be, unfortunately, affected by the fixed mindedness that they have acquired over the years. And it's funny, in Texas, they call these people cave people, colleagues
Yeah.
against virtually everything.
Everything. Yeah.
So the funny thing is that term is very true in schools. And this is where we now need to no longer support, but we need to hold people accountable. We need to be able to say in a very tactful and professional manner, we're not asking you if you'd like to change, we're expecting it. So help us understand what you need, because you not doing this work, to echo the words of Rick DeFore, is aligned with malpractice. And our kids don't deserve malpractice, because these are proven research ways that we can improve our schools so that all kids can learn at high levels, all being our new definition of all.
Right.
So in a nutshell, transformational leadership, we say it this way. The golden rule of transformational leadership is support must precede accountability.
Hmm.
Support is the investment you make in your faculty and staff, why, who, and how. And accountability is you seeking a return on that investment.
Right.
We find that most schools do a really good job of supporting, but not a very good job of seeking a return on their investment.
Hmm.
And it's going to take a combination of both those things to make the changes that we want to see happen in our schools actually happen.
Yeah, the compelling case for why change has to occur. So many schools and leaders skip that step of really articulating why the change is so necessary in their context, and therefore it becomes something that's almost inarguable. You say, "Here's the research. Here's what tells us is the most favorable practice," this is something that we expect. You're going to be supported as we move through the journey, but this is something that we're headed toward. I want to pivot here a little bit and have you connect some dots, because I think sometimes educators look at so many things we do mistakenly,
Yeah.
and they view so many actions and efforts as separate silos, or they think of them as you know one more thing we have to implement, right? So in the service of efficiency, without compromising effectiveness, can you connect some dots here that might help people sort of see how ideas are connected? This new definition of all, the PLC at work model,
Mm.
and the implementation of an RTI continuum. What are, instead of looking at, oh, now we have to introduce RTI, or now we're a PLC at work and we've got collaborative teams, or now we have to all means all. Those three are not separate silos. They are really connected. Connect those dots for
Right.
us.
Yeah, no, I'd love to, because I think that's often how people who aren't able to connect the dots see it, as all these things that we got to do and we don't have time for, and we're in the middle of a pandemic, right? So here's the way I like to frame it. Redesigning a system for our new definition of all is synonymous with the work that is aligned with becoming more equitable, right? So
Right.
when we talk about redesigning our system for all, we're talking about equity work. Now, the way that we redesign the system is by moving from a traditional school system to one that functions as a professional learning community, right? So when we become a professional learning community, what happens is we redesign our policies, our practices, our procedures, and our mindsets to be able to do this work. So let's look at it this way. Professional learning communities is what our schools and districts need to become in order for us to successfully create equitable schools that now have redesigned our systems so that all students can learn at high levels. Within the realm of a professional learning community, there's a strand called RTI. Some people know it as response to intervention. I like to view it as responsible teachers intervening. So within this scope of becoming a professional learning community, the educators come together and create, if you will, safety nets all over the school. Like when we see trapeze artists at a circus, they never fall to their death because there's like 7 nets that will catch them in case they fall. So the RTI piece of this work, or the RTI at work piece of this work, is us now creating in our newly created professional learning community these safety nets that will catch the kid that comes from a dysfunctional home, that will catch the kid who comes from a Spanish speaking or Mandarin or Arabic speaking only family, will catch the kid who didn't have firm foundational arithmetic skills but is now expected to learn algebra 1, geometry, algebra 2 moving forward. We create these nets called RTI nets that catch any kid and does not allow any kid to fall through the cracks.
Right.
This happens within the realm of a professional learning community. It's a strand of a professional learning community. And when we become a professional learning community, we have now redesigned a traditional school system to one that functions as a professional learning community, ensuring all kids learn at high levels.
Yeah, and that collective teacher efficacy that we often talk about, that emerges, our belief in our ability to make a difference for all learners. And
Right.
if the PLC for me, if the PLC model is the vehicle, then for
That's
me
right.
assessment is the engine. It's
That's
the
right.
information that
Let's
we
go.
gather that allows us to make the decisions. I mean, you look at the 4 guiding questions. The first 2 are assessment design questions. What do we
That's
want
right.
kids to know? And then how will we know that
Right.
they've learned it? And then the last 2 are the responding to assessment evidence questions. And I think that rather than seeing all of this as a separate silos, oh, now we have to talk about assessment, we really can do an act,
Right.
be active. I know you are, I am very active in making sure people understand that they all feed one another. They are all part of a
Right.
singular focus on creating that equity that we all seek. Why, obviously part of the PLC process is the heart of it is the work of collaborative teams learning together as professionals. Why do you think so many educators resist collaborative
Hmm.
opportunities?
Yeah.
Is it that their past experience has been poor, counterproductive? Is that they haven't been shown how to do it? Is that they just want to be left alone?
Mm.
What do you think is at?
Right.
I know I can't cast them as a monolith, but when you think about the resistance to collaboration, and where might the majority fall? Where's your experience told you that most people? Why are most who are resistant to collaborative efforts. Where does that fall for you?
It's funny because I think it's a combination of some of those things you mentioned. Number one, let's be real. 30 years ago, when I entered the profession, collaboration was not the norm.
Yeah.
The norm was, we're handing you the math guide, the language arts guide, the science guide, the teacher edition, and now you go into your classroom and you give it your best, right?
Yeah.
This idea of coming together with other colleagues who teach the same grade or course and digging into the data. I often refer to it as getting naked with the data. Yeah, I'm not getting naked with anybody because that's just not the way we do business around here, right? So,
Right.
so part of it is it's not something that was the norm when many of us who are still in schools first entered the profession. The second thing is, I think sometimes we equate what must happen during collaboration, which is looking at assessments, common assessments specifically, and having rich discussions around which of your kids got it, which of your kids didn't, is often viewed as a competitive sort of thing, right? Where if I reveal to my colleagues that only 20% of my kids learned what we all said they needed to learn while everyone else is at 80, 85, they're going to frown on me. They're going to look at me as less than. And I don't want to, once again, get naked with my data if it's going to reveal that I have some things that I need to work on. They're going to see me as weak. And so we're going to have to change the narrative and the understanding. I've gone to some places where that process is evaluative, right? And so who would want to be evaluated as they're getting naked with their data, right? That just wouldn't be right. So I think it's a combination of things. And I think it's going to be up to strong transformational leadership to really create a new narrative that says, if you're going to be a very effective educator in a public school professional setting, then you're going to have to learn how to collectively create the kind of synergy needed to become better at what we do via the help and the advice and the data that we see around us. And until that becomes the norm, right? Because that's what happens in a professional learning community. People are going to continue to see this as evaluative versus a necessary act that is going to help ensure that all of our kids learn at high levels.
Yeah, the vulnerability of being in a collaborative team without the right structures and protocols around it. And you spoke earlier about trust and how important trust is, starting with administration and creating a context where you're not being judged. But the effort here, I think sometimes the word, the acronym PLC is thrown around and people forget what it actually means. It's a community of professionals who learn together. And part of that learning is being vulnerable. But I understand folks who are hesitant because of the atmosphere that's created around how that data is misused. Common assessments. And you're right about the competitiveness amongst teachers as well, where, I look vulnerable in front of my colleagues. So it's a really complicated issue. And I know we can't cast them, like I said earlier, as a monolith, but we know that there's just so much resistance to collaboration. And yet, I know you know this, and I've seen it too, once people settle into the collaborative team and start to experience what it's like to not have to do this work alone, but to do it together, it's an incredible.
It's liberating
for them. Liberating for them.
Funny because when I was the high school principal, we were really struggling with this whole vulnerability piece, and I knew that the only way that I can promote the need for vulnerability, if you will, was for me to be vulnerable. So I actually asked our faculty and staff to evaluate my performance as principal twice a year, to give me feedback on whether or not I was performing at a level that the research said effective principals performed at, and whether or not they thought I was meeting that. So in other words, in order for our faculty and staff to embrace getting naked with their data, I had to get naked with the faculty and staff. Right. So, and mind you, that mine was somewhat evaluative because they were giving me feedback on, am I living truth to power when it comes to being an effective principal based on all this research that is out there on what effective principals do. And it helped me become a better principal. But many people told me as I ended my years at the high school, that it was that move that I put myself out there that allowed them to say, well, look, if Luis is putting himself out there with 140 staff, then the very least I can do is put myself out there with my biology team.
Right.
And so sometimes we have to make sure that we don't just talk the talk, but we walk it, right?
Yeah. You modeled that vulnerability, and like you say, that just shows and gives that kind of sponsorship to the idea of exposing yourself to those opportunities for feedback, and again makes us vulnerable, but it also shows, I think, vulnerability ultimately is a sign of strength and our
Yeah,
ability
I
to
agree.
open ourselves up to that. Now, before we
I
finish
agree.
up today, Luis, I want to ask you about specifically about English language learners.
Yeah.
As we sit here today in 2021, I want to ask you sort of a two-part question. What aspects about how we support ELs and how we serve them continue to have you frustrated? And also, on the other side of that, what are some things that you look at now in terms of how we serve ELs in 2021 that have you feeling most optimistic? So let's start with the frustration so we can end on the optimistic side. So what has you feeling frustrated about how ELs continue to be
Mm.
served here in 2021? And then let's flip and talk about the optimistic side.
Oh man, the frustration is twofold, right? The frustration is one, if schools do not exist in a vacuum, and today we function within the context of a global economy, what better asset to have in schools than kids who can walk out potentially multilingual, right?
Yeah.
To view these children as a deficit instead of an asset is just commonsensically wrong, ethically wrong in so many ways. Because if these children are able to maintain the language that they come in with, which also includes culture,
Right.
and they're able to, at the same time, develop and own a new language and new culture, that's an asset. My daughter graduated from her nursing program and was told upon graduation that it would be a while before she got a job. The minute they found out that she spoke Spanish and English, she was moved to the front of the line and was one of the first in her class to be placed at a hospital, working, doing what she loved. So the first frustration comes from the fact that the system and the people within the system continue to view these kids as a deficit versus an asset. The second frustration is that we have more than enough research on what we need to do in schools. I'm gonna paraphrase Ron Edmonds' words about we know all we need in order to make this happen. Whether people not want to implement it is a whole different discussion, right? He said it much more eloquently than me, but I think you get the gist.
Yeah.
We know how second language acquisition works. We know how to promote bilingualism. It's whether or not we're willing to do what we know in the profession that frustrates me, because I still go to schools that are still, after decades and decades of research on what must be done, not doing the right work because it's just another thing we have to do. And meanwhile, kids' lives are at stake. So those are the frustrations, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Things that I'm happy about is I'm beginning to see schools really sort of demonstrate this amazingness, right? A colleague of ours, Rosa Isaiah, who is doing some amazing work as I think a director today in the Norwalk La Mirada School District, came from a school where her kids, mostly English learners, mostly kids from poverty, flourished. She figured out, hey, this is how we did it. We need you to now replicate what we did, right? I've done work in Pasco School District near Washington. They have figured it out. There's a school that in the Central Valley here in California that is doing amazing work. Delano High School, proving that their graduation rate is almost 98%. Their EL graduation is at about 96, 97%. They've just about eliminated the opportunity gap that exists there. So the good thing is that we know what that looks like. In fact, Margarita Calderon and I right now are writing a book on the will and skill part of how we make sure EL kids learn. So we're hopeful that over time, more people will just open up the gift that they have in the research that's been conducted and actually use that gift to help kids learn at higher levels, especially those learning English as an additional language.
Your point about multilingual adults and folks in our society is one I'd not really thought of in that manner before. The idea that in any other aspect of society, being multilingual is such an advantage and is such a blessing to those who are in a foreign country, especially in a hospital or any other situation. When I work with schools overseas, the students who are in those schools are often multilingual, not
Right.
just two languages, but more because of their traveling around. And as you look at the larger picture, and this is going to be my own commentary, I think I'm right about this. It's hard not to think about, as you think about the positive side of multilingual adults, the positive side of multilingual students overseas. It is hard sometimes to ignore the racial element of
Absolutely.
the attitudes that we have about multilingual, and I'm using the royal we, not individuals, but the royal we collectively, about policies and practices. And I think when we talk about what is systemic racism and what is the
Mhm.
inequities that present themselves in our systems, it's the policies and structures that are in place that skew the system away from those students feeling as though they are valued members of our school community. So I appreciate your perspective on that. That really sort of brought some things to a greater, I just have a greater sense of clarity now, more than I had before, in terms of how that all kind of fits together, and the
Mm.
ways that structures need to I love that reference to the advantage that so many have being
Mhm.
multilingual, and yet we look at them as such a deficit.
Yeah, yo puedo hacer esta presentación completamente en español sin problema. And then I can do this. We have to tell our kids it's a superpower to walk out of your schools with more than one language. We should be celebrating that, honoring that. At graduations at our school, we had these kids stand up and be acknowledged for walking out of our schools bilingual, biliterate. Their diplomas got a gold seal because they were walking out of our schools bilingual, biliterate. We have to change the narrative and in a much more broader sense, right? So
Yeah, my mother, who my father and mother immigrated from Germany, once told me and said this often, that those who speak one language often look down on those who speak two. When I would kind of make fun as a kid, I would make fun of her accent and
yeah,
things like that, and she'd say, those who speak one language often look down on those who speak two. And it is a regret I have, not learning, whether it was my language of origin, German. I'm first generation Canadian, but my parents spoke German, or just the opportunity to learn French or Spanish or
right,
another language to be able to communicate. It is a regret I have,
yeah,
because when I'm overseas and in other countries, I just wish I could communicate with people, and I so
right,
appreciate their ability
yeah,
to speak English.
no kidding, right?
Two questions left as we finish up, and these are questions I ask everyone I have on the podcast. So
Sure.
here's the first one, and you can take this in any direction you wish to go. Educationally speaking, what keeps you up at night?
That's a good one. I think for me is not using what I have benefited from and the privileges I have to make our system much more equitable, much more powerful, and much more inclusive, right? For me, it's realizing that I've been granted a platform that can influence others and I'm not using it enough, right?
Yeah.
I think about the book that I would like to write, but then I don't write it. I speak at a place where people say, Luis, that was so inspirational. And then I leave thinking, but is inspiration going to be enough? So I kind of look in the mirror with that one and
Mhm.
ask myself, am I contributing to a system that denies kids an opportunity by not really kind of investing fully in all the knowledge that I've acquired over the years? Am I doing enough to really be part of a team that is is truly helping? Because when that day comes for me to leave Earth, if I reflect and say I could have done more, that will be a sad day. Not because I'm dying, but because I could have done more when I was alive. So
Yeah.
that's something that, I just turned 50, that I'm kind of looking at what else can I do to really, really help with people like yourself and others, really make a dent so that kids that I never meet one day, because I will be old and gray and maybe gone, can benefit from the small contribution I made. And knowing that I had that opportunity and didn't take advantage of it fully is really scary for me.
Well, as the 53-year-old elder statesman of this conversation, I'm going to put my junior psychologist hat on and
Yeah.
tell you that my 2 cents will be the fact that you are that reflective and that aware of the question itself means you are doing more than enough,
Mm,
because that level of awareness and that level of reflection, I think, is something that we all benefit from. And if we, I immediately feel it, feel it from you in terms of feeling inspired about that level of self-reflection and the question of,
yeah.
am I doing enough? And I absolutely love that. Last
Thank
question,
you.
Luis. Is about success and happiness. And I asked this question. I asked this question of everyone last year during when I started the podcast. I'm going to continue it as we go along. It's a question I ask everybody, and it's a pretty simple question with maybe not a not so simple answer. But if a random person stopped you on the street and asked you, "What's your definition of success?" How would you answer them?
Hmm. I'm gonna use what I call a Mattoism, because Mike Mattos is one of my best friends and one of my most important mentors, and he often describes it as the way that I define it, and that is limitless possibilities. You know, that if kids walk out of our schools and have limitless possibilities in line with what they want to accomplish, that would be a beautiful thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
um, it's not, it's funny because people often say, so limitless amount of money, and I'm like, no, you're not getting it. you
Mm-hmm.
don't you don't have to have limitless amount of income to do the things that you're passionate about. If I have a nephew who wants to be a really good electrician and that's what makes him happy, to know that we've given him everything in our system that will allow him to go down that path would be phenomenal, right? Would be
Mm-hmm.
phenomenal if that's what's going to make him happy, insofar as the kind of life he wants to live, the kind of time he wants to spend with his family. So nothing really deep. I think it's just limitless possibilities for the kids we serve on the path that they choose to take would be my idea of success.
Yeah, limitless possibilities. I think that is a wonderful way to
Yeah.
define success for sure. Listeners, you can and absolutely should follow Luis on Twitter. His Twitter handle is at L Cruz Consulting. That's LCRUZ Consulting, and you can follow Luis and tap into all of his work, the books and the forthcoming books, and all of the workshops and
Mm.
presentations. You certainly can find a lot more information on the solutiontree.com website, and find out about Luis as well. So, Luis, it was so great to reconnect with you today.
Thank you,
I
Tom.
really thanks for doing this, man. I really appreciate it.
Honor to be with you, my friend. Honor to be with you. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.